enabling the digital economy.
So today, I'm going to talk about instant payment infrastructures. And I'd like to share with you how the architecture of the payment infrastructure is consolidating to enable global real-time payments. And I'd like to share with you 3 points today. The first one is on real-time payments, which are payments that are predictable, traceable. Yes, and one of the technologies that we have heard so far that will enable instant payments or real-time payments is blockchain. So in our research, we're looking at the different approaches that are being taken on blockchain to facilitate global real-time payments. And we have found so far 3 different approaches: an incremental approach, a modular approach, and an architectural approach. Which brings me to the last point I'd like to make today, and that's on the different payment systems architectures, which in a way are consolidating to facilitate global real-time payments. I'm going to share with you 4 different architectures that we have had so far and go back in history a little bit while I'll share the different architectures. So I'm going to start with my first point on real-time payments. So I started the research together with Jonas Hetman and Michela Vital by asking ourselves, what do we mean when we talk about real-time payments? What is it that we mean when we talk about real-time? And we found out 2 different views on what real-time really means: an organizational view and a technical view on real-time. So after doing quite a lot of reading, we approached this organizational view on real-time, and what it says is basically that real-time means 1/10 of the total time it takes to complete a task or an activity. So for example, if we have a 10-year project, such as building a bridge, real-time for that project would be yearly figures, or reports once a year. If we have an activity or a project that lasts for 3 months, then real-time for that project would be weekly figures, which goes to the 1/10 rule of what real-time really is. However, when we have projects or activities that last for less than 3 months, we need to have direct access to that project or that activity to perceive it as real-time, which is what happens today with most of the payments that we have. They last less than 3 months. So we need a sense of access to that activity. Now, the second view that we found on what real-time really means is a technical view. And this view says basically that real-time is a system response that is predictable. So we know the outcome of that response. We know what will happen. And a response that arrives just in time so that other systems can continue to operate. In other words, we need to be just quick enough so that other systems can continue to operate. So after reading a lot about these 2 different views, we sat down and we started doing what academics seem to be good at, and that's thinking a lot, and then setting a definition of what we are going to talk about. And we defined real-time payments as a payment instrument that is traceable, predictable in its finality, and in which funds are made available just quick enough for its payment context. In other words, for a payment to be real-time, it needs to be traceable. People and organizations need to have a sense of access to the event and what's happening so that we perceive it as real-time. It needs to be predictable in its finality, so we know the payment will be executed with high certainty. And funds need to be available just quick enough so that other activities and tasks can continue to operate. So with this definition, what we mean is that real-time is no time, but rather real-time is just quick enough. And different payment contexts would demand different speeds. And I like to emphasize the context here because we set up in our research when we're approaching the different architectures and infrastructures of payment systems 4 different contexts. So we can have one country and one currency, as is the case here in Australia, and the developments that we have had on the instant payment platform in collaboration with Swift, which is the simplest scenario when we are talking about real-time payment instruments. But we can also have multiple currencies in one country when we are developing real-time payment instruments. Is anybody familiar with this country? This one is Panama, and they have the dollar and the Panaman balboa as legal tender within the country. They are both paired 1-to-1, but the point here is that once we start including extra or additional number of currencies, it becomes more complicated to develop real-time payment instruments. Now, the other approach is where we have multiple countries and one currency, as is the case with Europe. Also higher complexities. But the most complex one is D. We named them A, B, C, D, where we have at a global scale multiple countries and multiple currencies, and we are actually aiming to develop real-time payment instruments that are cross-currency. So we took these different contexts, and we ask ourselves in a way, okay, blockchain has been argued to facilitate global real-time payments. So we ask, okay, is blockchain a solution for this? And this brings me to the main questions that we're addressing with our research. And that is, what approaches are being taken on the use of blockchain across real-time payment platforms and infrastructures? And how are global real-time payment platforms and infrastructures organizing from an architectural stand? And this brings me to the main point that I'd like to make today, and that is that the payment infrastructure is in a way consolidating to facilitate global real-time payments. So this brings me to the second point I'd like to talk with you today, and the initial findings that we have had so far, and that's on the different approaches that are being taken on the use of blockchain technology to facilitate global real-time payments. And we have found 3 different approaches. So the first one is an incremental approach, where we basically build upon what we have, and we use the technology to increase efficiencies and make things better and quicker. But we also found a modular approach. And this approach is basically, okay, we build upon what we already have, but we also add a new piece to the puzzle, a new concept that will help us develop real-time payment instruments at a global scale. And the last approach is an architectural approach. So instead of only adding one new piece to the puzzle, we change how the pieces of the puzzle connect. So we change the fundamentals of the architecture. So let me extend a little bit on each of these approaches. The first one is the incremental approach, which is basically building upon existing knowledge and processes and concepts without radically changing them. We build upon what we know already, and we use blockchain to facilitate the creation of real-time payment instruments. And the ideas of this is basically improving clearing and settlement and the communication among different banks, with the development of standards or the improvement of the standards that we already have. And an example is the work that Swift is doing right now with the different tests that they are doing with blockchain. So it's building upon what we already have to facilitate global real-time payments. Now, the second approach, a modular approach, is basically extending the concepts that we use without radically changing the fundamentals. So in addition to building upon what we have, we actually add a new concept that would help us achieve real-time payments. And this can be seen with the further digitalization of assets with the use of digital tokens, but not all of them. rather the ones that are still relying on the banking infrastructure while using a token to develop a new kind of payment instrument. And the ideas of this is currency-backed tokens, and an example is Arise. This company is aiming to develop a token that's backed by the euro and the Danish krone in Denmark to facilitate real-time payments, as well as enabling smart money, or the idea of programming the token and setting rules at the money level. So with this approach, we're adding a new piece to the puzzle to facilitate global real-time payments. Now, and the last approach is an architectural approach. So with this approach, we're actually shifting the fundamental business processes while keeping some of the general concepts that we use. And the ideas of this architectural approach is basically a change in the governing structures that we have, and the idea of having a decentralized organization. So how many of you here attended the previous session on blockchain? Good. How many know what blockchain is by now? That's a great number. So let me just go and explain the main idea of blockchain to help you understand this approach a little better. So from a simple perspective, blockchain is a distributed database architecture in which the need for a central point of failure or control is reduced. Now with this approach, the main idea of building an organization where there is no one central institution, but rather control is distributed among different parties. And the example that I have here is MakerDAO. They are actually building a new payment instrument or a token that's also paired one-to-one to the dollar, but they are aiming also to not rely on the banking infrastructure. Rather, they are building an economic model so that the currency is paired one-to-one to the dollar, but they don't have any backing in the banking infrastructure. And they are also being used for the development of real-time payment instruments, right? And this brings me to the last point I'd like to talk with you today, and that's on the different payment systems architectures and how the architectures in a way are changing and consolidating to facilitate real-time payments. And I'm going to talk about 4 of them. But I'd like to take us back to the 14th century, actually, before I start describing or explaining them. Is anybody familiar with the House of Medici? Yes? Good. So the House of Medici, they were the first ones to develop a cross-border payment infrastructure. In the 1300s, they actually started as FX brokers, and then they developed what we know today as modern banking, with a central ledger and different banking institutions that were used to facilitate payments across borders. They used bills of exchange so that people didn't have to move coins of gold and silver, but rather just a bills of exchange, and they could move money basically across borders. So that's just one institution, similar to what we have in the number 2 of the figure there. And then so this allowed for high coordination and efficiency to some extent. But then in the 1800s, with the telegram technology and different financial institutions, we started to see transactions among different organizations. So this enabled further flexibility and reachability, and that's similar to the number 3 on the top. But it also increased complexity, because different channels involved different communication and higher levels of complexity. So then in 1973, we got SWIFT, which actually set the standard of how to communicate and increase levels of efficiency. That's similar to the number 1 there. And in a way, what it helped achieve was reduce costs and also improved efficiency, but at the same time enabled small banks and parties to compete because they had access to an infrastructure that was standardized. And then in 2008, with mobile technologies, what we have seen is a shift, again, towards a more consolidated ecosystem with payment platforms, similar again to number 2, where we have a more consolidated ecosystem so that coordination is supported on a more efficient way. Now, the expense here is that there is less reachability, right? But the use of mobile technology in a way is enabling that shift towards higher consolidation to enable higher levels of coordination. And then the number 4 is the blockchain 1 infrastructure, which this one is also highly consolidated. But in contrast to the platform-based approach, there is not one central institution. Rather, there is high consolidation among different parties with no single point of control. So my argument here is in a way that we are moving from a less consolidated ecosystem, so that would be the left-hand side from you, to a more consolidated ecosystem, so the right-hand side. And this consolidation is in a way enabling the creation of real-time payment instruments. So I'd like to kind of summarize the talk with 3 examples that I have. So the first one is Swift, where they're offering or supporting real-time payment instruments at a global scale with high levels of complexity. And the architecture is following number 1, or the one that had one central point, but it wasn't really consolidated. Rather, it's still loosely coupled. And the approach to blockchain is incremental. So it's building upon what we already have, and then improving it so that we can achieve real-time payment instruments at a global scale. Now, the second approach is Arise, where we have a payment instrument that is being developed across multiple countries, but it's only one currency. So there is a limitation there. And the architecture that they're following is a platform-based approach, or a consolidated institution where there is less reachability, but higher levels of coordination at the same time. And their approach to blockchain is modular, so creating a new concept that would be used to enable real-time payments. And the last approach is a MakerDAO. They are also creating a token or a currency, a new concept, but their architecture follows a blockchain-like approach, so not having one single platform or point of control, but rather having different parties that are controlling the service. And their approach to blockchain is modular and architectural. So they're adding a new concept, but they're also changing the fundamentals of how the infrastructure functions and operates. And what's interesting here, in a way, is that this change towards higher levels of consolidation, we have seen it also in recent talks. So I was here on Monday when they discussed about the future payment market infrastructures. Was anybody here in that talk? Yeah. They discussed basically 3 different scenarios. One is that we're basically, with the improvements that we're having across the payment infrastructure, we'll maintain the current structure that we have, so a status quo scenario. The second one was we will actually move towards higher levels of consolidation, so less parties involved. And the last one was that actually we will have more interoperable fragmentation. So different parties and higher interoperability between the parties supporting the payment infrastructure. So my take on that talk would be actually that we're moving towards higher levels of consolidation, and in a way the interoperability that we will have, at least from the initial research and initial findings, will be among consolidated regions or parts. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Juan.
Thank you.